Fatality, my diamonds that cold. Versace trunks, I hit my backstroke. Knock on the door.
Welcome back to Houdini is Hip. In the previous part, we looked at ocean spectra. Now, ocean spectra allows us to render oceans, and those oceans can move over time, and you can have an animation of it. However, that isn't simulation. All that is displacement of a grid. So let's just say that we have this particular grid over here, right? And this is our ocean surface, right? So at the moment, in its current state, it wouldn't be deformed in any way until we apply spectra, right? So spectra or a spectrum, we looked at that in the previous part. Now, when we apply it to this grid will be deformed. But if we wanted to simulate something, so let's just say that we had a ship over here on the ocean surface, right? So there's just a ship on the ocean surface, and we want to simulate that. It would be inefficient to simulate this entire space over here, right? So all we want to actually do is simulate a small space around the ship, like that, and then blend it back in with the rest of the grid, and then apply spectra to the areas outside of this area over here, right? So all these areas outside of here, they just have spectra applied, but we wanted to blend in with this piece in the center. So that's what we're going to look at in this part. And now there are some other things that are related to that. For example, if this ship is moving in a particular direction, then we want this box that's surrounding it to move with it. So if the ship moves to an area over here, then we want this box to move along with it. So the area of simulation moves with it. And so this is going to bring us onto a couple of new concepts. The first one is going to be tanks, right? So this over here, the simulation area, is going to take place in a tank. A tank is just a confined space in which we can simulate different types of fluid simulations at larger scales. So we'll have a tank that surrounds the area of simulation. The other thing that we'll have is that many of these things will be guided. So the actual movement of the water inside of this block over here is going to need to be guided by an ocean spectrum, right? So we're going to have to feed in things like velocity and displacement into this little square over here, into this tank. And we're going to use that to define how that water behaves so that it behaves similarly to what's outside of it, right? So that when we blend it together, it's pretty much seamless. Then what we're going to have to look at is the blending of these two together, right? How do we take this and extend it back out into this full grid? So all of that is going to be covered in this part. And in the next part, we'll look at actual simulation and simulation settings and how we can actually make our simulations look really good, as well as things like white water. So that sort of white foam that gathers around areas of high vorticity and high velocity. We're going to be looking at all of that. But for now, let's take a look at guided ocean simulations. Right, so inside of Houdini, we're going to go ahead and just look at what a flat tank looks like. We're going to go over to our shelf tools over here, all the way over to oceans. Now, the reason that we're going to be using the ocean shelf tools is because it sets up a lot of these settings for us. Some of them are a little bit obscure, and you have to dig kind of deep for those to make sense. So we're going to start with the shelf tools, and as we go, we'll look at how we can kind of leave the shelf tools behind and just create these setups on our own. So flat tank over here, you'll see that says select object, follow, and press enter. You can just press enter with no object, and then it'll give you this box. Press enter again, place it at the origin, and you end up with this tank over here. You can see that it is a 15 by 15 square, and it is a thin layer of particles, right? So I just want to show you what it creates. If we go over here, we have the actual simulation. So that's that green one over there. Over here, we have the mesh that it generates for us. So if we take a look over here, you can see that it actually generates a mesh. I'm just going to hide our objects. You can see that we have this mesh over here. That's the actual fluid surface. And so I'm going to hide that as well. Then we have a fluid interior, which is just the same thing. It's getting merged in here. It's that same surface, but this one is going to be used for the volume rendering. And then over here, we have the flat tank initial. This is actually what I want to focus on for now, because this is the important part. So as you can see, we have this merge collisions. If we had something like a ship, then this would be brought in and fed into this ocean source, right? This ocean source over here, this is how we set up a tank. So you can see that it is initialized as a flat tank over here, and we have a collision coming into the second input. The reason we have it coming into the second input is that if we have a collider, it'll cut it out of these particles, right? So a ship won't have particles inside of the ship because it'll cut it out. On this wave tank, over here, we have a whole bunch of settings. We have layer size, which is dependent on particle separation. So that's going to define how thick this layer of particles should be. You'll see that we also have boundary layers over here. So the boundary is this area over here. You can see that there's two boxes. That area between it is the boundary. And you can see that we have a size and a center over here. That's just going to change the size of this box. So we can make it bigger or smaller, right? So that's our simulation space. Now, as it is, nothing's really happening with it. But if we go over to our flat tank simulation over here and just play it back with our real-time toggle enabled, you'll see that there's very slight movement going on, but there's nothing really much going on with it. All it's doing is it's doing some reseeding, and this water is just kind of sitting very still. You can, of course, add something like a collider. So if I were to just drop a sphere over here, let's just go inside. I'll make it a bit bigger, make it a 5 uniform scale, do a bit of a transform on it. At frame 1, we'll just move it down below the origin. Keyframe it over there, and at frame 24, it'll be up here. Keyframe that again, add a null, and we can just call this sphere underscore collision. So let's also just make sure that we're doing some of our good practices that we've been following. Let's convert this to a VDB from polygons, plug it in over here. And so now we have this collider, just like that. Go up a level, into our flat tank sim, we'll use a static object over here. On the static object, we'll go over to our subpath. It's going to be our sphere collision, use deforming geometry. And then under the collisions tab, we're going to be using a volume sample. So we set that to volume sample. Down at the bottom, the proxy volume is going to be that volume, right? Sphere collision. Okay, so now we just want to plug that in with the rest of this over here. So we plug it into our merge node, swap the inputs around so that left affects right. And if we play this back, you'll see that we have this sphere that comes through the water. If you want to do what we did before, you can merge this with a surface collider, and that'll give you better collisions. So we go over here. We won't have this as a volume collider. So we'll use the use surface collisions. And then we're just going to have to add another one over here. So we have sphere collision. We can call this underscore volume. And we can make another one over here. And this will be sphere collision surface. And this one won't be a VDB. It'll be the actual surface over here. So now we have a volume and a surface. Go over here. Use surface collisions, and then just choose our surface collision over here. Right, we play this back. So over here, you can see that the water is going outside of these bounds. So you can very easily just go over to your flat tank initial over here. Increase its size to about 15 on Y and move it up by 7.5, or a little bit less, 5, something like that. Back in here, and that'll work quite nicely. Right? So this is how you might go about setting up a tank. And it's pretty straightforward, right? With this, what you can do is you can mesh this out, and some of the settings over here that are going to be different from your usual flip solver are things like narrowband over here. You'll see that we've usually used particle field. In this case, we're using narrowband so that it only generates a thin surface of particles, right? This is for when you don't want to simulate everything below the surface, you just want that surface layer. There's also going to be settings over here on the flip solver for things like narrowband over here. Right, okay, so that's just one example. I'm just going to delete everything. And now I want to show you how we can do the same thing, but with a guided ocean layer. So if we use a guided ocean layer, it's going to create a very similar setup. But the idea with the guided ocean layer is that we actually have something for it to follow. So this could be something like a ship. So if we were to just go over here and create a geometry node and just call this collider, dive inside, create a rubber toy, right? So we just have this rubber toy over here. We'll give it a transform. So we'll give it a movement of 2 meters per second. So we'll do 2 times at time, just like that. And that'll just move it along at 2 meters per second. Okay, go up a level. And now if we have this selected and we go over to the guided ocean layer, it'll create a guided ocean layer based on this object. And so you'll see many of the same things that we've seen before. There are going to be a lot more nodes though, right? So we have a lot more nodes to work with. This collider was what we created, but it created all of this for us. I'm going to just hide everything because I want to show you everything one at a time. Firstly, we have the guide ocean layer initial. That's what we looked at quite in depth in the last example. But if we look at it now, it's a little bit different, right? So firstly, we still have this collider coming in. Right? It's getting fed into a wave tank, but you'll notice that there are actually waves in this wave tank. The reason is because when we use the guided ocean layer, it actually uses some of the spectrum stuff that we learned in the last part, right? So over here, it's generating a spectrum for us. We have a preview so we can see what it looks like, right? So that's the ocean that it's generating. It feeds that into the wave tank over here. And as we play this back, you'll see that it evaluates over time. The other thing that it does is that it actually evaluates depending on where our collider is, right? So this flip toy over here, this rubber toy, as it moves along, you'll see that this moves with it. And this is simply because of this expression over here under the center. So if you take a look, it just has this centroid expression. So it's fetching the centroid of this merge follow, right? So merge follow is this input up here. And it's just saying get the X of the centroid. And then at the end over there, it's just saying get the Z of the centroid. And so it's always kind of just following this along, right? It doesn't follow in the Y-axis because that doesn't really make much sense. So it just follows in X and Z. You'll see we have all of the same things over here, right? We have a layer size. The layer size and the guide surface thickness are going to be dependent on the particle separation. So you can see that it's 8 times and 12 times. So if we reduce our particle separation to something like 0.005, the layer actually gets thinner, right? So the higher resolution you go, the thinner the layer actually gets. We're actually going to put this back up to 0.15 for now. Now, this is where it starts to get a bit confusing, right? Because we have this over here, but it actually contains many, many different things that get fed into our solver. If we go over here to the out node, you can see that we don't have any particles anymore. What we do have are a bunch of these volumes. These volumes are fairly important to understand. I don't want you to get too stuck into them, but understand that surface is going to be one of the more important ones. So let's just take a look at what it does. So we have all of those volumes that are coming in, and then it gets split up, right? So each one of these blast nodes deletes everything except some volume, right? So this one is deleting everything except surface. This one is deleting everything except velocity, everything except the guide sink, and everything except the guide surface. So what do each one of these do? Well, the guide surface is just the surface of the fluid, right? If we take a look at this with a volume slice, and we just plug this in over here, you can see that it's the surface of the water, right? And if we just change the axis on this, you can see that this over here is actually technically our wave tank, right? It's the same surface. So it's that surface information so that we know where the surface of the water is. As for velocity, that's just going to be the velocity generated over here. We can take a look at the volume over here as well. If we use our ocean preview and just say point velocity, and then switch on the point trails, you can see that it actually has velocity, right? And that's going to be fed in over here into the wave tank, and that's going to generate velocities for us as well. These two over here are going to be interesting, and I'll explain guide sink a little bit more later. But the guide sink, if we take a look at it, it's very similar to our surface. So I'm just going to show you our surface again, right? Surface is up here. But as you can see, it's actually a band, right? It's got this red at the bottom and red at the top. So those are high values. But this sink over here has low values at the bottom. What it's actually doing is it's saying that this underneath we can get rid of, right? So sink is going to get rid of any particles underneath. So this over here is defining a surface, but it's not exactly sure what's up and what's down. The sink over here ensures that we know that we need to remove particles under the surface, right? So that's going to make more sense later, but just understand that sink is for getting rid of particles. Finally, we have our guiding surface over here. And this is going to be very similar to our actual surface over here, right? So we have the boundary and we have our guiding surface. So on the ocean wave tank over here, you can see that we have two outputs. The first one is initial and the second one is maintain. So initial is, of course, the initial state of the simulation. All of this stuff over here is to ensure that it follows this movement as it goes along, right? So it follows this ocean surface. Okay, so if we go into our guide ocean sim over here, so guide ocean layer underscore sim, I'm just going to press L to lay it out. You can press Shift and S to change our connectors. And this is where we're going to start finding the changes that are going to be a bit more confusing. And it's the reason why I decided to use the shelf tools for this tutorial, because we're going to have things like this over here, this guiding ocean volume. And as you can see, it's actually feeding in all of those things that we output, right, in our initial. So all of these things down here, the boundary surface, the boundary velocity, the guiding sink, and the guiding surface, that's all going to get fed in over here. Right, we have the guiding surface, the velocity, and the sink. And it's going to use this to calculate the ocean volume, right? Over here on the guided ocean layer, we also have the initial data, which is a particle field, which is not the same as our narrow band, right? It may seem like we're just simulating a narrow band surface over here, but in this case, we're actually creating a particle field and using a sink to remove everything underneath it. So there's a slight difference in that, but it's a bit of a nuanced explanation, so you don't have to worry about it too much. In the flip solver over here, you will see that we have a bunch of settings that have all been set up for this type of simulation. The one thing that I do want to bring your attention to is on the solver setting over here, all of these values have been changed to guiding collision, guiding weights, guiding vol, guiding surface, and guiding sink, right? So these fields have to have their names changed for when we're doing guided ocean simulation. This is why I didn't want you to worry about creating this from scratch. It's good to use the shelf tools in this situation because of things like this, right? It's a lot easier to get up and running rather than having to remember to make these changes and having all of these things set up over here. Over on the left side, we have our collider, and this collider is going to be that object that we created. I'm going to make this flip collider a bit bigger. So over here, I'm just going to increase its scale to something like 3, right? So it's just a bit bigger. And now if we play this back, what you'll see is that we have ocean simulation, just like that. However, you will also notice that our collider isn't moving. That's simply because we have deforming geometry switched off. We can switch it on over there. Now if we play it back, we have our rubber toy pushing through this surface, right? So this is how you would do ocean simulation. So I'm just going to lower him a bit over here. So lower it by -2 or -1. Yeah, let's go over to the guide ocean layer over here and decrease my particle separation, something like 0.08, and then play this back for a bit. Now, I do want you to note how thick this layer becomes over here. Sometimes, if that's too many particles for what you're trying to simulate, you can make adjustments on this initial over here, right? So over here, where it has layer size and guiding surface thickness, you can halve these. So if you want to go 4 times particle separation and 6 times particle separation, then what that's going to do is make that a much thinner simulation layer. Also going to increase the speed of this collider, so 3 times. And go back over here. And of course, we can now implement all of the little tricks that we know. So for our collider, we can go over here. We can create 2 nulls. One's going to be our VDB collider. The other is going to be our surface collider. And then all we have to do is VDB from polygons over here, just like that. Decrease the voxel size, and that's good, right? So then we go over to our guide over here. And we have the one collider, and this one we're going to go down over here. And so this one I'm just going to switch to volume sample over here, with the proxy volume being our collider, VDB collider, right? So that's the one. We can duplicate it over. We can call this surface collider. This one over here, we're not going to be using the volume sample. We're going to switch this to surface collisions. And then we can just go over here and choose our surface collider, right? Plug that in as well. Play this back. Okay, so that's pretty cool. We have this over here, and it's simulating as it's moving through our ocean. So what we would do from here is we would want to reintroduce this back into our ocean grid, right? Because we don't want to just render this little piece. We might want to render this as piece of an ocean, right? So we want to extend this back out. So that's where the next part comes in, right? So over here, you'll see we have fluid interior, ocean fluid, and then we have these 2 extended ones down here. The first one I'm going to look at is this ocean fluid, because we have this over here, right? This is bringing in the import over here. You can see it's a DOP import. And so it's just bringing in our particles for us. If we go up to the top over here, you can see that it's bringing in all of the information from our simulation. And then it's doing some weird things over here. So what this is doing is it's actually removing information from under the surface. So I can prove this to you if we just blast away the particles. So we can use a blast over here. We're just going to blast everything except the surface. So we can say delete non-selected. Over here, I'm going to use a volume slice. And let's take a look at what we have. I know that the range for this is generally going to be between -0.6 and 0.6. So I'm just going to use that over there so we can visualize it correctly. And that's going to be our surface. Now this surface over here is what gets used to actually generate our mesh that gets rendered, right? So when we actually go over here down to the particle fluid surface, this layer that gets generated is based on this surface layer, right? So this surface over here defines that sort of surface when we're busy meshing it out. So these steps over here are some pre-processing for this surface. What this does over here is firstly, it resizes this to match the size of the sink. So that sink volume that I was talking about that removes information from underneath the surface. Then over here, it actually combines it with that sink, right? And when we do that, you can see that it actually differentiates what's above the surface and what's below the surface, right? So over here, we're not sure what's above and what's below. And once we do this union over here with the sink, we can then see what's below the surface. This is extremely useful because we can end up with a thin layer, which can then be extended out for the rest of the ocean, right? So then we use this normalize over here. That just makes sure that this fits between a good range of values. And then a fluid compressed cache, and then it finally gets cached out over here. But an interesting thing is that this compressed cache also gets used in another place, right? So I'm going to show you where that's used. If we go over to the fluid layer extended, right? So guided ocean layer, fluid extended, open this up. Once again, this is going to look like a bit of a mess, but I'll go through it with you so you can understand what's going on. Over on the right side, we're importing that compressed cache, right? So this over here, that's getting imported. That gets imported over here. And this on the right side is going to be the extended fluid, right? So you can see that only this area around our collider is getting simulated. And as we move along, you can see that the simulation space is limited to this area over here. Now, how does it know which area to actually limit this by? Well, that's going to be dependent on this region value over here, right? So you can see that it actually fetches these values for the bounding box from our ocean initial layer, right? So it does a bunch of calculations, but basically this is just fetching it from this over here, right? So it's saying, okay, this is the simulation area, and then it flattens everything outside of that area, right? You can see that it does some smoothing towards the edges, just so that it blends in with this area around it. And this is what I was talking about earlier over here, right? This is that block over there. So this is our simulation space. This area over here is the simulation space that I was talking about. And now we're blending it back in with the rest of the grid. So what's all of this over on the left? Well, this actually fetches our spectra, so we can't really see it, but it then creates two masks, right? This mask over here is the one that defines where our simulation is taking place. And what this does is it actually cuts out an area in our spectra. And this over here ensures that we don't apply spectra to the areas over here that have already been simulated, right? We don't want to apply spectra to the areas where we already have simulation data going on. We only want to apply it to these flat areas. But we do want to apply the smaller details to this simulated area. That's why we split it up over here, right? We have the high frequency mask over here, and then we have the mask to avoid. And all of this over here is just for preview purposes. So if we go to the ocean evaluate, we can see what it will actually look like, right? So that's what it'll look like. So over here, if you want to see how it works, you can extend this flatten outside, and we'll just pad the bounds and do something like 3 and 3, right? So as you can see, the spectra is being applied to the areas outside of the simulation space, and the simulation space is keeping the data from the actual simulation. This is how we blend these two together, right? So this on the left, you can sort of ignore. The important thing is that we have this over here where we extend our ocean outwards and keep the simulation area. But this over here is important because we're fetching our spectra, we're defining where it should be applied, and then we're saving out the spectra and the mask. So the spectra itself is going to be one frame. You can see that it's not time dependent, and it's just a single frame, so you can save that to disk. And then the bake masks over here, that's going to be a frame range. So I'm just going to delete the channels for this and just save out maybe 36 frames. Just save that to disk. And so now what we have is we have an extended surface over here. And now we have our spectra saved out, which also respects this fluid surface, right? It ignores the area where the simulation data and will only apply our spectra outside. That's what these masks are for. It's making sure that the spectra doesn't exist in the areas where the masks are. Then the last two things are the guided ocean layer fluid interior. If we take a look at this, it is actually just what we created earlier. It's just this mesh over here, right? This one over on the right-hand side is that same one, but extended. So if we go down here, you can see that it's that same thing that we had, but it's now extended, right? And this is actually what's going to be used by the ocean procedural tool to render. And we can see this if we go to the stage. Fortunately, it also sets this up for us, right? So we have the Houdini ocean procedural, and you can see over here exactly what it's doing, right? And now it should all make sense. What it's doing is it's fetching our spectra file that we saved to disk. It's fetching our masks that we saved to disk. It's fetching our geometry, right? So it's fetching our geometry from the fluid interior. And then it's taking the group. It's saying only take the top because that's the only thing that we want to apply spectra to. So it's only taking the top, right, of this geometry. That's what it's going to be applying spectra to. And then it does all of the stuff that we've seen in the previous part. So all we have to do now is what we've done before. We just have to grab a camera. So I can just grab a camera over here, lights and cameras, camera. We'll go ahead and use a dome light, and then we'll use a Karma render settings. So just a Karma node right over here. Plug the dome light in, and then a Houdini preview procedurals. So preview procedurals after the render settings. Now, if we go ahead and use a Karma CPU render, it will of course be very low res. You can see that as it is, we have our grid that's being brought in, and we have our simulation area. The simulation area has some detail to it, and that's because the actual geometry has some detail to it. But to see the ocean spectrum being applied correctly, we have to change that viewport setting on our procedural ocean. So we can set the viewport quality up to 1. And once we do that, it'll take a second, but in a moment, you'll see exactly what it does. There we go. So that is exactly what we wanted. What it's doing now is it's taking that simulation area. You can see that we still have that simulation area existing over there, but it's now applying spectra everywhere outside of that simulation area, right? So it's extending the ocean outwards from that little simulation space. So all we've actually done is simulated this area in the middle, and everything else is based on spectra. And then from here, of course, you can go ahead and add things like HDRIs, and you can render. All right, so I hope that that gives you an idea of how we go about simulating an area and then applying it back into an ocean spectrum, right? I just went through all of the steps, basically just focusing on shelf tools in this part so that we can understand exactly what's happening at every step. In the next part, we're going to be breaking it apart a little bit and not focusing on using the shelf tools so much. And we're actually going to be looking at how we can get a good looking render, how we can get a good looking simulation, and how we can also get some good looking whitewater. So all of that's going to be in the next part. I hope to see you there. Bye.